Hey, what's going on, guys? Ryan again with rpkcustoms.com. I've had some requests to do a paint and weather tutorial for my R2 Sabers. So that's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to take you through all the steps you need to be able to finish one of these off yourself. So this is basically how the R2 Saber comes from me. I take the pour spout off and I clip a lot of the little nubs just from the casting or the mold when this is cast. So it's not super clean, but it's not super rough either. And from here, we are going to clean it up just a little bit. I will go ahead and show you everything that I use, and then we'll get started. All right, so for paint, we are going to need a gloss black for the grenade section. And this is just Rust-Oleum. Any gloss black is going to work. This is just what happens to be at my local Home Depot. The gray that I use for the rest of the hilt is just, again, Rust-Oleum. This is their granite satin. And for the thin neck, I use, again, Rust-Oleum. This is just what they have at Home Depot. You can try to match the color and get it maybe at Ace Hardware. I know Ace Hardware paint is pretty much just Rust-Oleum, just rebranded. This one is, let's see, Antique Brass Metallic. And that's your number right there, 7274. And the way that I paint these, I like to layer the paints so that it looks more antique. So I'm going to be using these Testors paints. This one is metallic silver. And again, this is just what they had down at my local hobby shop. You can use pretty much any paint. I'm also using a Revell. This is just a matte black. This is also going to be layered on top of the gray and on top of the silver. And you are going to need a gold color to brush on for the gold traces. And this is by Vallejo, I think is how you pronounce that. This is just the gold that I have in my my paint kit. You can use, again, you can use Testors. It just has to be kind of a metallic-y gold color. And besides paint, you're going to need masking tape. I'm just using this yellow. I recommend blue. This yellow, it's not very sticky, and you can have a hard time kind of getting it to work without peeling off before you paint. So I recommend blue. I'm going to be using yellow just because this is what I have on hand. Now I'm going to be using a needle file, but you can use sandpaper. Needle files are just a little bit easier and quicker to work with, so that's what I'll be using. And of course, you're going to need a couple of brushes. Preferably kind of crappy brushes because you're going to be dry brushing a lot, and it tends to fray up the brush tips and kind of makes them not usable after this. So get yourself a couple of crappy paint brushes. You're going to want one with a fine tip, maybe finer than this. I'm probably going to change this one out. And you're going to want one just to do some dry brushing with. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is take my needle file, and I'm just going to go around the hilt and clean up all the areas that look a little rough from the casting. Now, I don't clean this up perfectly, just because from the reference photos that we have, you can see that this thing was not really made perfect. It was made quick and dirty. You can see the casting lines in it. You can see a lot of imperfections in it. So I'm just going around and hitting a lot of the high points, like you can see right in there. I'm going to take that down just a little bit, but I'm not going to take it out completely. I want to leave the casting line because in the one reference photo, when it's sitting on the counter, you can see a casting line here, which makes me think that you can see the entire casting line all the way up. And there are theories that this is probably a cast of a cast, so there might be multiple casting lines in there. So I'm going to be keeping the casting line looking somewhat rough. I'm not going to be taking a lot of material off of the clamp and the booster section. I'm going to leave that pretty prominent just because I feel like that's probably how it is on the actual prop. The needle file I'm using is kind of like a half moon shape. I've got other ones. This is kind of a crappy one. You can see the tips broken off, and yeah, I've had this for a long time, but it still works. So we're going to use it. So you're just going to go around. So you can still see the casting line. I'm going to take more off right up in there. All right, I like how that turned out. You can still see the line, but it's not really rough looking. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to just clean it up to my liking. I'm not going to film all of this just because it's pretty straightforward. The grenade section is what I'm going to clean up probably the most. You can see a couple of those little nubs that I missed right there when I was clipping them off. But we're going to clean that up. One imperfection that is just in the mold itself, I'm not sure why or how this imperfection got in there, but you can see a little nub right there that's too big for me to clip off. So I'm just going to hit that. I'll just do that on video so you can see. But I'm just going to file that down. And resin is super soft, so it really does not take a lot to sand something like this down, or file it down in this case. And you can see it's almost all the way gone. And you can see it is gone. So it doesn't take much. Again, you can do this with sandpaper. I just like using these little needle files. I think they work pretty good. It makes quick work of the imperfections. All right, so I'm going to go around. I'm going to do the rest of the hilt, and then I'm going to come back. All right, so I got this cleaned up to my liking. Like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to make it perfect because the original prop is not perfect at all, as we can see in the reference photos. But this is good enough. You can see in between the grenade section is cleaned up. And this took me literally under 10 minutes to do all this with the needle file. If you're using sandpaper, it might take a little bit longer, but the needle file makes quick work of resin. So I'm going to take this to the sink. I'm going to wash all the dust off of this. You're going to want to wash this with a degreaser, like Dawn dish soap, something like that, just to take all the grease off, all of the resin dust off, so that the paint will stick to the hilt. So I'm going to go wash this up, and then we are going to move on to the next step. All right, we got this thing all washed up. I wiped it down with a paper towel after I washed it, and then I let it air dry for about 20-30 minutes. The first thing I'm going to be doing is spraying the black on the grenade section. So I am just going right along the top of the clamp. Hopefully you guys can see all this. It's really hard to film myself doing anything on camera. You just want to make sure that you don't get any of the black for the grenade section on the clamp or the booster section. If you get a little bit of overspray on the neck, that's okay. Well, not down here, but more up here, because we're going to be hitting that with a bronze paint. So you'll be covering that. Down here, we're going to be stenciling this off. So you want to make sure you don't get any overspray on the clamp or booster section. The thin neck section is a little bit difficult to tape up just because of that lip. And this is why I recommend blue tape instead of yellow, because yellow doesn't like to stick sometimes. But once you have it, I just like to unroll a good section of it and then just start wrapping up. And then once you get to the emitter and you have something else to stick to, it's pretty good. Even though I kind of screwed that up, didn't I? Let's try that again. Okay, I got it that time. And when you're taping these up, it does not have to be pretty. It just has to work. Like I said, you just don't want overspray on a lot of parts. And just be careful when you are sticking all this down that you don't accidentally squeeze right here at the thin neck, because that will push this tape up or pull it up. And it looks like we're good. So we can go out and spray this now. All right, we are back. It has been a couple of weeks since I filmed the last part of this video. Due to my accident, I can actually see well enough where I can do a little bit of work up close. So we are going to try to finish off this paint tutorial. You can see I've got the grenade section painted. So now we are going to have to do the stenciling work, and this is going to be probably the most complicated part of the paint and weathering process of these things. So I've got a guide here. This is one of the only reference photos that we have of this prop. So we're going to be applying a stencil the best that we can to our resin saber. We are going to need toothpaste. You can use liquid latex as well. I just like to use this toothpaste because I like the consistency of it. It seems to transfer where I want to go extremely well. I also use a couple of small paint brushes. You can also use toothpicks, and you are also going to need a gray paint. All right, so to start, I am just going to put a blob of toothpaste here on this piece of paper. And I'm going to be sitting down for this, so I'm not going to be able to see the camera. So I'm just going to draw some lines on the paper so I know where I am in frame. I apologize if that looks kind of crappy, but we're just going to make do. All right, I'm going to put my reference photo just up here so I can see it. All right, so I usually like to do the booster section first, just because that's kind of the most complicated part. Now, we can only see the front of this thing. We don't have any pictures of the sides or the back, so the sides and back are going to have to be slightly idealized, and we're just going to have to kind of make do with that. But you can see the front is pretty clear. We can see there's a lot of paint chipped off right around here in the booster section, and you can see the white resin underneath. So like I said, we're just going to do our best to try to follow the reference photo. So I like to go around the bottom edge a little bit first, just to give myself a base. And then you can kind of work your way up from there. And try not to get too perfect with this, because there's a lot of small spots of paint left over. So you don't want to black it out completely. I'm leaving a few spots, just a few small spots open here. I'm not actually filling in this entire area with toothpaste. I'm just kind of blobbing it on and leaving a few gaps exposed. All right, and for tiny little scrapes, like you see, grab a toothpick. You know, all these little tiny little scrapes right here that you see, you can take your toothpick and get a nice healthy chunk of this toothpaste, and you can see how it kind of looks pointed. What I like to do is just kind of take that point and drag it across, and you get a little, what looks like a little scratch out of the paint when you're all done. All right, we pretty much got the front booster section done. So now we're gonna have to go to the side. And like I said before, the sides we're going to have to idealize just a little bit. You can see in the reference photos that it looks like the paint is almost completely gone on this side of the clamp and the booster section, and it appears the booster section over on this side. I'm going to assume that there's a lot of paint missing on this side of the clamp section. Just because there's a lot of paint missing on this side, you can see there's a lot of paint missing on that side. So I'm assuming just the way you grab this thing and the way it was probably handled, there's probably paint missing on the other side, a lot of paint missing on the other side of the clamp. So we're going to go ahead and do that next. And again, just like we did over here with this little blob, I am just kind of blobbing it on, and I'm purposefully leaving small open areas. The trick with weathering is you don't want to do anything perfect. Don't focus on making something perfect. Weathering is never perfect. So, you know, just use your best judgment and have fun. And even if you make a mistake with this, or what you think is going to be a mistake, we can fix that later on with the detail work that we're going to do. So for the back of this, I am, again, just going purely on how I think the prop would naturally weather. So if your hand wraps around, you know, it's probably going to be weathered a little bit up top here and maybe a little bit down below here. All right, so I got the booster section done the way I want it. You can't really see it right now because it's white on white. It's going to be kind of difficult to see. Once we get the paint on and then we start layering it, it's going to look a lot better. You can see I got the side done here and the side done here. So next I like to do the clamp. You can see in the reference photo, I'm actually going to set this up like that. You can see in the reference photo that there's a lot of paint missing off this side and a lot of scratching up in here. Same with this section of the clamp. You can see a little bit of paint right in there, kind of chipping off. We're going to follow this the best we can. So since the majority of the paint is missing off of this side of the clamp, I am going to start there, and then I'm kind of just going to work my way around. So since there is a lot of paint, or what looks to be a lot of paint missing from this side, I'm going to assume that there is a lot of paint missing from this side of the clamp because of this side. Like I said, you can see a lot of paint missing here, and then a lot of paint missing on this side of the clamp up here. So I'm going to try to match that, just because I think that is where the paint probably naturally flaked off. And again, just try to remember, you don't want to be perfect with this, because if you're perfect, it's not going to look natural. So now I'm just taking the paintbrush, getting a glob, and I'm using the tip of the toothpaste that's kind of globbed up on there, just like I did with the toothpick, and kind of dragging it across the clamp where I want some surface scratches. I'm going to be doing the emitter next. Reason for that is I like to rest the Saber on the pommel while I'm working. So we are going to be doing the pommel last. Now you can see there's a giant chunk missing out of the emitter section here. We are actually going to be doing all the damage last, and that is because they painted this thing when it was all whole, when there was no damage at all. So you really want the white to show under here, because if we did the damage first and then painted it, you wouldn't see the white. It would just all be gray, and it would not look natural. Would not look like natural weathering. So we are going to be doing all of the damage up in the emitter and on the edges of the clamp last. We actually do have one more shot of the damage and how far back the damage goes. So we're going to be referencing that photo later on when it comes to doing all this. Right now, we're just focusing on the paint. So you can see the emitter is really not, or the paint on the emitter is not really flaked off all that much. You can see it's pretty much just right around the edge here, the two edges. And then there's some small little scratches up in here. So we're going to try to replicate that the best that we can. Emitter won't take long, and then we're going to move on to the pommel. So I'm basically just taking the edge of the paintbrush and dragging it along the edge of the emitter. And I like to skip a section. Again, we can't see the back, so we're going to have to idealize this a little bit. I like to skip sections every now and then, just because it makes the weathering look a little bit more natural. So the key to this is just to try to make everything look as natural as possible. And since the scratches on the emitter, or the paint flakes, look a little bit small, I'm actually going to be using my toothpick for that. So you can do as many as you want around the back. I am just going to be doing one more small spot just to, again, make it look more natural. So I'm going to do a couple just like that, and maybe one or two around here. All right, so we got the emitter done. Now we're going to be moving on to the pommel. You can see there's a little bit of flaking. Let me grab something to point with. There's a little bit of flaking on the tops of the valley of the pommel cubes here. You can see this pommel cube has a lot of flaking going on. And it looks like this one has a lot of flaking going on, or a lot of wear. So we're going to replicate that the best we can. And I'm just trying to get the tops of these pommel cube valleys. So the cubes around the back, I am just going around and I'm going to give them a light pass on the corners. You don't want everything to look even again. So, you know, if I do this corner here and maybe have a gap in the middle, do a little bit on this corner, a little bit on this corner, and then I'll leave the other corner painted. That way it looks all uneven, which is, again, natural looking for weathering. Okay, and the pommel is done. Again, let me see if I can turn a light so you guys can see a little bit better. And one thing I actually forgot to do, completely forgot to do, is tape off the grenade section. I think I'm still a little out of it from my accident, and I am forgetting the steps. So I'm going to do that real quick. It's just, you want to do that first, just because it's a little bit difficult to tape this up and not touch any of your stenciling. You don't want to touch your stenciling because it will smear and then it just won't look right. Okay, I got the grenade section taped up and we are going to go out and paint this. Now you're going to want to let this sit and dry for probably overnight, just because when we wash the toothpaste off, we're going to have to run this underwater, and we don't want the paint to be wet at all when we do that, because we don't want to wash the paint off. So you're going to want to make sure it's good and dry before you start washing the toothpaste off. Okay, it has been 24 hours and the paint should be nice and cured up by now. It's time to wash this, but I thought before I do, I would just mention that when you do wash this, don't use hot water. You can use lukewarm water or cold water, but because these things are made out of resin, heat can actually warp the resin. So especially here up by the thin neck, if it gets too hot, you can have some bending issues and it just won't look straight. You can see right there, I touched the toothpaste with my finger. So I'm going to go wash this up, and then we are going to paint the neck. All right, we got her all washed up. So this is what it should look like when you're all done. It doesn't look like much right now, but we still have a couple more steps to do on this that's really going to make this pop. So the next step is to paint the neck, and I'm going to be using this Rust-Oleum metallic, antique brass metallic. And I got this right down at Home Depot. I really like this color. You can see that the neck on the reference photo looks a little bit more bronze than it does gold or copper. And I found that this color, even though the cap looks a little bit darker, this actually does a pretty good job replicating this color in here. Okay, we're back. And you can see we did the bronze color around the neck. So we got that done. The next step is going to be to sand off the rings of the grenade section. We are going to be painting the rings silver. So if you really don't want to sand this, I mean, you don't have to, but if we look at the reference photo, we can see that there are some white little chips out of the paint. One thing I don't know if I mentioned or not when I was going over the things that you would need for this build is a sanding sponge. And that's because the sanding sponge is a little bit rigid. If you just use sandpaper, you might accidentally go into the rings of the grenade section, and you want to avoid going inside. You just want to hit the face. And the sanding sponge is a really good tool to help you do that. If you don't have a sanding sponge and you don't want to buy one, you can wrap some sandpaper around a wood block and use that. It's effectively the same thing. This is pretty simple to do. It takes the paint off pretty quick. You just want to make sure, be very careful that you don't hit the bottom of the grenade section right here, because that is black, like we see right here. So you want to make sure you don't hit that. If you are not comfortable doing it freehand, you can wrap a little bit of tape around it just to ensure that you don't touch that with the sanding sponge. Okay, we got done with the sanding, and you can see it's not perfect. There is still a little bit of black showing, but like I said, we're going to be painting this, so a lot of that's going to be covered. We just want a couple of exposed areas because we are going to be doing a little bit of weathering. We're going to have this white pop through the silver a little bit. So now that that's done, we can move on to my favorite part of building these things. This is the part of the build that really makes this replica come to life and pop. So we are going to be doing all of the layering, and that is where these little tester's paints come in. And you are going to want a small brush to do all the layering work. Let me turn a light on so you can see a little bit better. So you want a small brush like this. You can also use a very fine detail brush, but I typically just like to use just a standard, just a cheapy brush, because these enamel paints, you're not going to be able to wash this off. You know, you could soak these in acetone or something, but these brushes are so cheap that, you know, why bother? And just take one last look at what this gray looks like. Very unimpressive, you know, kind of dark, not very accurate, but after we apply this paint, it is going to make this thing come to life. Okay, so we are basically going to be dry brushing. What I typically do, I just dip the brush in the paint, try to take a lot off the, try to take as much as I can off of the brush tip on the side of the paint jar, and then I just kind of wipe off the excess on the paper. Okay, and now we are going to go over every gray section with this paint. So what I usually do is I just find a section. I usually start, you know, booster section. It doesn't really matter where you start. We are going to be doing the whole thing anyway. So you just kind of dab where you want it. And then you can take your finger and dab it just to blend it in. Now the goal with this is you want the dark gray to show through just a little bit. So you can see the little bit that I did there. You know, you can kind of play around with it until you get it the way you like it. But that's what it should look like. When you're done, you can see I didn't touch any of the white spots in here. So the white spots are still exposed. And again, when you are weathering something, you don't want anything to be perfect. So don't spend too much time on it. You know, dab it on, dab it off. There's really no way you can screw this up. Really, the only way you can screw it up is by trying to do it perfect. We're really just trying to get that layered effect, because that layered effect is what makes it look, again, like vintage paint. And this prop is pretty old now. And in the reference photo, pull the reference photo over here. I mean, you can see how just weathered and gross looking this paint is. You can see in some spots it looks kind of metallic-y, and in other spots it looks kind of flat. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And these bigger sections down here are actually pretty easy to do, since there's no white pockets showing through, or very little white pockets. You know, it's very easy. Just dab on, dab off, dab on, dab off. Okay, now we got the booster and the pommel pretty much done. And hopefully you can see how good that is turning out. You know, you have the darker shades shining through. So we are going to go ahead and do the clamp section, and then we are going to do the emitter. So I'm going to get that done, and then I'm going to come back and we are going to move on to the next step. Okay, we have finished the silver layering. You can see just how much it makes the piece pop. You know, that dark gray color is really unimpressive until you layer the silver over top of it. And one thing I forgot to mention is you can do too much weathering. You have to know when to stop. You know, like I said, weathering is very hard to screw up. You just kind of dab it on, dab it off, and just be quick with it. If you play around with it too much, it starts to look a little bit too perfect and a little bit less like weathering and more like intentional painting. So you just have to know when to stop. You know, you just want it to look blotchy like that. And that is what makes the piece look old, makes the paint look old, and really brings the replica to life. So now we are going to do the rings of the grenade section. I'm going to tape off a few of these sections here just to match the paint chips that we see on the grenade section. A few of these we are going to go back and hit them with a needle file, just because you can't really do a stencil on the grenade section with the toothpaste like we did on the clamp and booster section, because we are going to be using a sponge to be dabbing the paint on these. It's very, very hard to use a brush and get all these lines straight. It's almost nearly impossible unless you are like a wizard with a brush. So we're going to be using a sponge for the grenade section and this ring right here. And this is the sponge we're going to be using. You can see I have used it many times already, but that's okay. It's still very, very squishy, very pliable, so still usable. We're going to be using this. What I like to do is just take the lid off, put a little bit on, wipe it off, and then dab it on the paper to get all the excess off. That way you're not getting too much paint on these rings, and it's not going to bleed down into the valleys of the grenade section. And I almost forgot to tape this section off. So if we look at the reference photo, we can see that that big white section is the second ring up, and it's on the left side of the clamp. So we are just going to stick that piece of tape right there. Maybe up just a little bit more. And this does not have to be perfect. It just has to block a little bit of the sponge. So and I'm just doing this very lightly. You don't want to push too hard because, again, the paint might come out of the sponge and go into the valleys of your grenade section, and you don't want that to happen. You really don't want to have to repaint the grenade section after you've done all this. And I think that looks pretty good. I left a little bit of the black showing underneath just to give it a more weathered look. So I really like how that turned out. I just have to do the ring here in the thin neck. Again, just going very lightly. So now the silver is pretty much all done. The silver layering anyway. So now we're going to go in with the black. Okay, we are going to start with the black. And again, I'm using the Revell. And this is a matte black. Matte, I'm assuming number 6. Give it a shake. And I'm going to be using a different set of paintbrushes because my original one is pretty frayed out. If you can see the reference photo, you can see that the clamp card looks to be painted black with a little bit of gold brushed in there. So we are going to go ahead and hit that with some black. And then we are going to be doing a second layer of layering, of weathering on the booster section. There are some black smudges here, which I'm assuming they tried to make look like the paint chips on the V2. I'm not really sure, but we're going to try to replicate that the best that we can. So I'm going to be using the, hopefully you can see, I'm going to be using the fine tip to do the clamp section. All right, so that didn't take too long. I put it on a little bit thin, so you can still see a little bit of the gray coming through. I just think that gives it more of a weathered look. You know, if you look at the reference photo, you can see that it's not a 100% straight black. Okay, so before the paint dried completely, I forgot, if you look at the reference photos, there is a little bit of white, the white resin shining through on the clamp section. I did put a stencil on there with the toothpaste. So before the paint dried, I just took a toothpick and kind of cleaned up where I had the toothpaste so that the white would shine through. And now we're going to wait for this to dry. We're going to move to the booster section. We got to wait for this to dry because we are going to be doing the gold over top of that. And we don't want the black to smear in the gold. So we're going to wait for that to dry, and we're going to start on the booster section. So on the reference photo, you can see that there are some black smudges here and down here. So we're going to go around and we're going to look at the reference photo while we do this and try to replicate the placement and the shape of these black smudges the best that we can. All right, and we are going to want a small piece of a paper towel just so that we can dab the black away. And with the black, it doesn't take much to dab. Just one light dab, and it pretty much soaks up all the paint. Like I said, this is kind of thin paint, so you know, it doesn't really take much. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. You want it to be kind of light because the reference photo looks a little bit light. Looks like I need to do just a little bit more in here after looking at the reference photo. I'll hold both of them up side by side so you can get a idea. I know this probably isn't transferring well to the camera. I'm just trying to follow the reference photos the best that I can. Now, like I said before, we basically only have one shot of this thing, which is the front. So the booster section all around probably most likely has the black smudging going on. So you're really going to have to idealize this a little bit. You're just going to have to kind of improvise and go with what you think it would probably look like. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go around and randomly put some black smudges around on the silver. Don't do it on the white because obviously the white's chipped off. So if the white section is chipped off paint. So if the paint chipped off, the black would go with it. So there should be no black on the white sections. So I'm just going to go around and just randomly put some black smudging. And again, this is weathering, so do not do this perfect. Don't try to do anything perfect. I am just very quickly going through and putting random black paint in where I think it probably would go or where I think it would look good. Okay, so I went around the entire booster section and added a little bit of black paint all the way around. So I really like how that turned out. I really hope you guys can see this. I know my lighting is terrible. I really need to work on getting better lighting. But I will take some pictures of this and put them up in the video so you guys can see what this looks like after I'm done with it. If we look at the reference photos, you can see there's a little bit of dark, I don't know if it's dark gray, I don't know if it's more black paint, but I'm going to try to replicate that the best I can. And because I don't know if this is black paint or a shadow, I am going to be doing this extremely light. I just want to give the effect that it's a little bit darker on this section of the emitter. So there's not going to be any hard lines in the paint or anything like that. I basically just want it to look like a shadow or a dark spot. So you can see how it looks just a little bit darker here in this section than it does everywhere else. Just because this is weathering and we don't know what the back of this prop looks like, we are going to add just a little bit more of this shadow effect. Maybe down here. Again, going very, very lightly and dabbing as you go. All right, and I think that looks pretty good. You can see it compared to, put the brush down real quick. You can see it compared to the reference photo. So I like how that turned out. I'm happy with it. So we are going to move on to the next step, which is the gold trace, or the little bit of gold paint on the traces of the clamp card, which it looks like they used a Empire Strikes Back graphics card for this, which is pretty cool. And I did add that when I designed the mold for this thing. So we are going to be doing the gold traces next. All right, so if we look at the reference photo, we can see, to point with, we can see that the gold really only runs along the one side of the clamp card, and there's a little bit up top, and the more you go down, the longer the strips get. Now, if you look really close, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this on the camera. It looks like the gold traces are in between where the gold traces are supposed to be. So we are going to try to replicate this the best that we can. It is on some of the actual traces, like on this one, it looks like the gold is on the trace, but this down here looks like they are in between the traces. So we're going to hit this. Like I said, the gold that we are using is the Vallejo, and it's very thin, so I might have to do this a couple times just to get a good coat on. You can see how thin that is. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not even in the camera. Hopefully you can see that. Now it also looks like the gold is kind of all along this edge here, on the very, very edge. You can see it a little bit more up here. So we're going to go through with the brush. I'm going to get a little bit more paint on here. And this is a flat, kind of a flat detail brush. So I am just going to run the bristles along the very edge. Just like that. And I'm going to add just a little bit more over here. All right, I am pretty happy with that. Hopefully you guys can see. I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out, so I'm going to leave it just like the way it is. And that is really it for the painting. This next part, or this next step, is completely optional. You do not have to do this if you don't want to, if you don't feel comfortable with it, or if you want to make this replica look like it did in the movie, you don't have to do this step. We are going to make this prop, or this replica, how it looks today, with all of the damage that's done on the clamp and on the emitter. So in the reference photo, you can see that it looks like it has been cracked off up here on the emitter and down here on the clamp especially. And it's very hard to replicate something that has been broken. We can't really break this because it wouldn't break in the same way. You know, you can go out and maybe smash this on a rock or something and try to get the same effect, but it's not going to be exactly the same, exactly in the same spot. So we are actually going to be taking a needle file, and in this case, this is a half moon needle file. You can use a flat needle file, but I find the flat needle files to be just a little bit too thick. These come to a pretty sharp point in the corner, so it allows us to have a little bit more control and detail over where we want this to go. So I'm going to have to sit down to do this because I have to concentrate. Again, you guys might not feel comfortable doing this, and you don't have to. This thing, the one shot that we have of this thing in R2's dome in Return of the Jedi, we can see that the emitter is not cracked off. So, I'm just making this how the prop is sitting today. So I'm going to do the emitter first. You can see the Saber looks like it's slightly turned in this photograph. So move these paintbrushes out of the way. So if we turn it how it looks in the photograph, which is about right there, it appears, get a straight edge. Let me get something straighter than that. The start of the crack lines up about 2/3 of the way through the clamp. So I'm going to start probably right about here. I'll just make a little mark just so I know. And there's one reference photo of the actual prop sitting on a table. And I think it's sitting like this. And you can see how far back it's actually cracked. And it's cracked quite a ways back there. It looks like it kind of dips in a little bit, goes down, and then the crack kind of flares out back here. We don't really have a good reference point as to where that crack ends, but we are going to have to idealize that a little bit. Now, judging from this reference photo and the reference photo of this sitting on the table, we can see that the crack, let me get something to point with. We can see that the crack goes in a little bit and then comes out, and there's a little point here, and then it goes in again, comes out. And when it's sitting on the table, it looks like it is cracked off pretty close to this step in the emitter, this last step right here. So, I'm going to try to replicate that the best I can by eye, and we will go from there. If you are going to do this, just be very careful because this goes pretty quick through the resin, and if you screw up, it's permanent. So just, you might want to draw a line where you want this thing to go and just go very slow. I've done probably about 50 of these by now, so I'm pretty familiar with how this works, and I'm not going to be drawing a template. And like I said, I'm going to start right here, and I am going to be looking at this reference photo when I do the front, and then when we get to the back, I'm going to switch, and I'm going to be looking at the photo of this sitting on the table. And I really just use this like a saw. Like I said, it cuts through the resin extremely easy. And this first crack looks pretty deep. It looks pretty close to this first step in the emitter. So we are going to saw it down pretty close to that step. About like that. Looks pretty good to me. And then I am going to go back in like this and go pretty much straight down. Then I'm going to come back. And do something like that. We're going to go clean this up after we get the main outline done. And you can see how that's just sawing right through the resin. It doesn't take much force at all. I am just trying to go slow and be careful because, like I said, it is very easy to go a little bit too far. Okay, so that is our main damage point. We are going to go in and clean these points up and make them look a little bit better. But if we line it up there, I mean, that's pretty close to my eye. So I'm just going to go in and kind of round these points off a little bit with the file. This is the same file I was using to cut. And I'm flattening the bottom of this off just so that it looks a little bit more like it was actually cracked and not cut. Like I said, it's really hard to replicate a break. Okay, let's see if you guys can see that. I'm trying to keep it a little bit jagged looking just to, again, replicate a break and not a cut. But when you hold it up to the reference photo, it looks pretty close. So we are going to go ahead and do the damage on the clamp now. The bottom here is the majority of the damage. These two edges, that one looks a little bit more cracked off than what this one does, but this one we're probably just going to take a little bit off that corner, but these are going to be the ones that we are going to have to pay a little bit of attention to. So I'm going to be doing the exact same thing I did with the emitter. I'm going to be using the same file, and I'm just going to be filing down this way. Again, I'm going to hold the reference photo pretty close and see how we do. And I can see that it looks like it's on the, it starts at the second trace up. So this is the second trace right here. So we're going to start there. And this one's going to be hard. It's going to be more difficult because just the location it's in and the way it looks. So it's not going to be perfect. And now I'm just taking the file and kind of digging into the clamp a little bit, because you can see in the reference photo, the crack extends into the clamp card. So I just want to get down to there a little bit. And when you're doing this, just make sure you're not hitting this clamp rail over here. And the more rough and jagged you make this, the better it's going to look, or the more accurate it's going to look. You don't want a clean cut. You want some jagged edges, and that makes it look more like a break. So I'm trying not to be too perfect with this. It's kind of difficult when you are trying to make something perfect. You guys can see that. Hold it up next to the reference photo. That's pretty close. I might take it up just a little bit more. All right. I'm liking the way that turned out. So I am going to move on to the top two. And I'm just using the flat section of this file to just kind of flatten this top corner off. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. All right, I like the way that turned out. So we are going to move on. I am going to just do some nicks and scratches in the grenade section like we see in the reference photo. So just a little nick out of the paint. And I'm going to do this on the entire grenade section. When I move to the back, again, we're going to have to idealize it a little bit. I'm just going to do a few here and there. So I think we can call this done. There is one more thing you can do. It's not necessary, but you can see the gold neck, how it looks pretty clean. You can do a little bit of weathering to this. You can go in and kind of scrape the edges off, which I think I might do, and then we can add something to it. So let me just do a little bit of weathering to I'm just barely touching the edges. I'm not digging too deep. You know, you're just trying to make this look kind of beat up. And I'm just going around the back and just kind of hitting that just to make it all, again, look uniform. All right, so in the reference photo, you can see that it looks a little bit dark up in the bronze of the thin neck. I mean, the thin neck looks pretty rough, and it's really hard to replicate all of the unevenness that is in the real prop. So you can see mine, you know, it turned out perfect, more or less, besides the casting line. So, you know, it's really hard to, again, just get that rough texture, try to replicate that rough texture. But one trick I use to get just kind of the darker and metallic-y look is I like to use graphite. And they usually use this for keys, for door locks. Obviously, there's a key right there. But it comes out gray and it smears. It's like a dry lubricant. So you can see it's kind of got a metallic-y sheen to it. And you can kind of rub it around and it just kind of turns your finger gray. It also turns paint gray. So I like to just put a little bit on there and then just rub it around. And this will kind of give it that metallic-y, kind of darker, splotchy finish. Just like that. It's not a huge detail, but, you know, if you want to do it, you can. It's very simple. This stuff is pretty cheap. I think it's like $1, $2 for this little thing. And I've been using this for probably almost a decade. Okay, the last thing that we have to do to finish this piece up is just to paint the hole in the pommel. And we can see in the reference photo when this is sitting on the table that it is pretty dark in there. We're not really sure how deep that hole is. Painting this black makes it appear really deep. So we're going to do that. You can use the same black that you used for the grenade section. I'm going to be using a matte black for this just to give it a little bit more depth. So we are going to tape that off. I am just going to be wrapping some paper around here to protect it from overspray. And you should be left with something like that. Something a little bit like that. And then I am just going to tape it on just to seal everything up, to once again protect it from overspray. This little hangy deal right here doesn't really matter. I'll just hold that. Put a couple of squirts of black paint in that hole. All right, I just peeled the tape off, and this is what we're left with. When it's black, you can't see where the hole ends in there unless you are looking right down in there with the light. You can see that the paint is still a little bit wet, and that's okay. It will dry to be a matte black. You can see it looks pretty flat down in there. We just wanted to give it the effect that the hole is deep. And that is it. We have a completed R2 Saber.